When I bought the Bambu Lab X1 Carbon, it was actually my fourth 3D printer. By that point, I already knew what I liked and what I didn't want to deal with anymore, so I wanted something that I could send a file to and not having to babysit it for the next few hours. So I got the X1 Carbon, the flagship 3D printer from Bambu Lab at the time, and now 2 years later, I've used it a lot more than I expected, and I think I've got a pretty clear picture of where it shines and where it still has some rough edges. The first thing that still impresses me is the print quality. Honestly, after all this time, it's difficult to complain about the results. Most prints come out looking clean, without having to do any tuning, layer lines are consistent, and it just feels like a pretty straightforward printer to use. Of course, you can always spend hours tweaking settings to squeeze out a tiny bit more quality, but for everyday printing, the default presets in the slicer software are pretty versatile. The other thing that made a huge difference is reliability. I've printed hundreds of parts on this machine, and if the first layer sticks, there is about a 95% chance that the print is going to finish successfully. Also, usually I'm printing PLA on the cool plate with a layer of glue on top, so that's my setup. Maybe without the glue layer I would have more errors, but I just don't want to waste filament on failed prints. Now, getting reliable prints sounds basic, but honestly from the past printers I've had, very often the prints would detach during the printing, and that's an issue because not only will you waste filament, you will also waste time that will delay the whole workflow. So that's honestly one of the biggest reasons I still enjoy using this printer. Most of the time the prints come out as they should the first try. And now for what's probably the biggest strength of the X1 Carbon, the fact that it's easy to use. Not just for someone who's new to 3D printing, but even after you've been printing for years, it removes a lot of little annoyances and hiccups that used to be considered normal back in the day. That ties into another big advantage, the speed. The X1C is pretty fast, with a maximum of 500 mm per second. Things that used to take hours on my older printers will now finish quickly, and I don't have to think twice about reprinting parts and testing variations. Sending prints is pretty straightforward with the internet connection. Calibration happens automatically, and you spend more time making things than fixing the printer. The maintenance you have to do sometimes is also pretty straightforward, but with a few caveats we'll talk about later in the video. However, the printer even tells you when you have to do the maintenance for example, lubricate the lead screws, which is also helpful if you don't want to keep track of maintenance schedules. It's one less thing to worry about. Now, one feature I didn't think I'd use that much, but is actually really helpful, is the internet connectivity. Being able to check on the print from another room is surprisingly useful. The camera isn't amazing, but it's more than good enough to see if everything looks okay. The app also sends notifications if the printer runs into a problem, like if the filament breaks or runs out, and it'll let you know when the print has finished. It's a small convenience, but after using it for a while, you definitely will miss it on printers that don't have it yet. Another thing I ended up liking more than I expected is the whole Bambu Lab ecosystem. I don't like being tied into one company's products, but their own filaments are actually pretty good, and what's nice is you are not forced to use them, they're just better with this machine. They're reasonably priced and they have a little NFC chip in it, so when you put a new spool in the AMS, it will automatically recognize it, know what material and what color it is, and also, by the way, the white spools you see here are reusable, so you can use the same spool for a new refill that is also cheaper to buy. So once you have bought a few full spools, you can just keep buying refills instead of throwing away plastic spools every time. Now there is also the AMS. Obviously, the headline feature here is multicolor printing, and it does work well. But honestly, I don't use it that very often. The reason is pretty simple. It's that multicolor printing with a single nozzle creates a lot of waste. Every time you change the color, the printer has to purge the old filament from the nozzle and replace it with a new color. And so after a large print, because every layer requires a purge process, you can end up with a surprising pile of plastic blobs sitting next to the printer. So personally, I use the AMS more as an automatic filament loader. I can keep different materials or colors loaded, and I can switch between them without having to touch the printer. So, for example, when I'm printing out a prototype or a test, I can send the file from my computer and select some random filament instead of the higher quality ones without having to deal with the hassle of changing them manually on the machine. Sometimes I'll also use it to add a few layers of color filament on the top of a print. For example, if I'm printing a text or a logo. In those cases, the waste stays pretty reasonable and a two-color 3D print also looks a bit more interesting. Bambu Lab has newer 3D printers that have a dual nozzle that don't have that waste problem, so it's clear that they recognized it as a limitation and they have taken steps to improve on that. So that's one thing to consider if you are doubting between this printer or the newer Bambu Lab printers. By default, third-party cardboard or paper spools don't really play nicely with the AMS. They tend to wear over time, but I have been using simple 3D printed adapter rings to reinforce the edges of the spool, and that basically solves the issue. Once you do that, you can use way more filament brands without having to worry about compatibility. I've also had filament get stuck inside the AMS a couple of times. It's not super common, but when it happens, it's a bit annoying to deal with. You have to remove a few screws to get access to the Bowden tubes and manually pull the broken filament out. So a little annoying but easy to solve. Now, one last thing that doesn't really affect printing but I still appreciate is the design. The X1C actually looks like an appliance, so it's enclosed, looks quite modern, and it doesn't have the typical DIY machine sitting in a workbench vibe. If it's sitting in your office or a living room, it won't look that much out of space. I store mine by the normal printer and it looks quite okay here. Now, after 2 years, there are definitely a few things that have started to bother me. So the biggest one is probably the noise. The printer itself isn't terrible while it's moving, but the chamber fan that pulls hot air out of the enclosure can get surprisingly loud. If you 3D print PLA with the door closed, the fan spends quite a bit of time running, and it's definitely not something I'd want next to me all day if I'm trying to concentrate. Another thing to notice is the weight. It's a solid machine which helps with stability, but moving it isn't exactly fun, so once you've found a place for it, it will probably stay there for a long time. Now for the maintenance, as I said, there are a few caveats. Every now and then, especially when I'm using third-party filaments or materials like ABS, filament can get stuck inside the extruder, and unfortunately, clearing the jam isn't as simple as opening a cover. You actually have to remove the hot end assembly from the print head, take parts of the extruder apart, and dig out the broken piece of filament. That's like a 20 to a half an hour process that will again slow you down if you are trying to work and get stuff done on time. It's not something to have to do every week, but when it happens, it's definitely more work than I'd like. Considering that filament jams are a pretty normal part of owning a 3D printer, an easier to service extruder would have been nice. The last thing is the LiDAR system. When the printer first came out, this feature was marketed quite a lot, but in practice it's just okay. Like if there is a huge failure on the build plate, it will usually notice, but if just one corner of the 3D print has come slightly off from the build plate, the printer often keeps going on anyway, and you will only discover the worst part once the print has finished. So while the LiDAR is not completely useless, it's not something I would rely on if I'm starting a large print. So after 2 years, would I still recommend the X1 Carbon? I would say yes, but with a caveat. If you're looking at a used X1 Carbon or find one that's on sale for a good price, I still think it's a really solid buy. Mine has been incredibly reliable, the print quality is still excellent, and it's one of those printers that will just let you focus on making things instead of constantly having to fix the machine. That said, if I were buying a brand new Bambu Lab printer today, I probably wouldn't choose the X1 Carbon anymore, not because there's anything wrong with it, but simply because Bambu has released newer printers that offer better features for the money. They have improved things like multicolor printing, and in general, the newer lineup just makes more sense if you're starting from scratch. Now, if you're on a tighter budget, I'd honestly also take a serious look at the A1 or even the A1 Mini. Unless you specifically need an enclosed printer, they're also fantastic value. The enclosure is useful, but only if you're planning to print materials like ABS, ASA, or carbon fiber reinforced filaments. So for the money of an used X1C, you could also get an A1 that's new. So I don't regret buying the X1C at all. It's been the best printer I have owned so far, But if I was shopping today, I would probably buy one of Bambu Lab's newer machines instead. I hope this video was useful to you. If that's the case, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.